afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking it out to the very bitter end. And thank you to PSC for a really incredible conference. It's just been really wonderful to be with you all, and there's just been an enormous number of really thought-provoking and moving talks, and it's such an honor to be on a panel with so many wonderful, powerful, brilliant women, and Ben will be here later. And what I want to talk about in my time is the power of words, and the power of organizing, and the power of solidarity. And Kamal spoke this morning. It was very exciting for me to meet Kamal because we have one of those odd Twitter friendships where we feel like we've been friends for a long time, and we met for the first time in person today, so that was very exciting. But he spoke this morning about Jewish Israelis' mentality needing to change. And I actually am not sure. I want to start with a story that I draw strength from when things are looking quite dark, and it's about my mother-in-law, who's Jewish Israeli. She was born in 1938 in Jerusalem, and she talks about how her father spoke Arabic, and he spoke Hebrew, and he spoke Yiddish, and he spoke German, and he spoke Russian, and I'm probably forgetting a language or two, and that the Jerusalem that she remembers as a child was one where everyone lived together, and it wasn't a utopia, and there were tensions. I don't want to pretend that it was something that it wasn't, but it did exist, and that was less than a lifetime ago, and I think we need to remember that. There wasn't there's no fundamental conflict between two peoples that can't be resolved or that is rooted in ancient hatreds. There's a set of systems that are in place that have created the reality that we live in now, and just the way things have changed so much in less than a lifetime, they can change again. And I think that people's mentalities are based on their material conditions. So you think about South Africa right before apartheid ended, and back then, it was at its most racist, most xenophobic, right before the end of the apartheid regime. And these days, you can't find a single white South African who, wasn't fighting desperately against apartheid. So those things change as material conditions change, and that's what we need to be focused on. And I think Israel, of course, needs to be forced to do this. Virginia Tilley talked about it this morning. Settler colonial states are not going to, out of the goodness of their heart, change their mind. It's our job and Palestinians on the ground job to force that change to happen, and people will follow. And part of that force is shifting our language, and so that's where we get to the power of words. And I think that apartheid, the word that this conference was organized around, is an incredibly important term, and Hazem made this point this morning about the political importance of apartheid, and I thought it was very interesting. I had a little point of departure because I think it was an interesting point and probably true that apartheid was landed upon as a way to not talk about colonialism. But at the same time, I also think that apartheid as a word has incredible power, and we can thank our South African comrades for that, because it indicates a state, beyond all the legalities, what we know, what we learned over the decades of the anti-apartheid struggle, is that apartheid indicates a state that is outside the bounds of global norms, and it demands action against it, and thanks to the history, again, of the anti-apartheid movement, it demands BDS. And I think that's why Israel and people and organizations and governments allied with Israel have fought so hard against the word apartheid being used to describe Israel, because they understand that what follows from it being an apartheid state is that action needs to be taken globally against it. And I remember Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, published a book in 2006 called Peace Not Apartheid, and he paid an incredible political cost for it. And Jewish Voice for Peace, my organization, is often in the avant-garde, so to speak, of the Jewish community. And we bring conversations that have not begun in our communities yet. I mean, that's the way we're moving our community and moving our community narrative. And that's the job of some of us, is to push the boundaries of the narrative, either in our own communities or in broader communities. And over the last 10 to 15 years, the word apartheid has become normalized. And this summer, conveniently, with the nation-state bill, also the state of apartheid, Israel's essentially declared itself an apartheid state. And that was actually very interesting from the perspective of the Jewish community, because I saw organizations kind of across the political spectrum this summer object to that law. It was the most in agreement JVP's ever been with such a broad range of organizations. And some of them were objecting out of principle, and some of them were objecting because it made Israel look bad. And we can of course we know it's ridiculous that people are shocked by the nation-state bill. We know that those policies have existed for decades, and really since the since the state began. But these are these important inflection points that help people to understand the situation, that help to change the narrative. So I'm very encouraged by the fact a poll came out this year that, in the US, that Jewish college students' support for Israel has dropped 32% between 2010 and 2016. So that, our community, my community, is moving, and that's important. So words matter, especially in terms of what actions they can lead to, and also education matters. And I think that's what we've been doing today that's so important in terms of building a common understanding of what we're struggling against, but also what we're struggling for. But in the end, I have to say, it is not about facts. It's about power. And that's what we need to be talking about, and that's what we need to be building towards. So I want to propose what's most important is to build grassroots power, and Huda, you talked about that, the way that's been built. I mean, I'm so jealous. We don't have anything like that in the United States. We're way behind you guys. But that's what changes things, is winning campaigns and changing policy. And so we're way behind you. I was with some trade unions yesterday. I know there's a lot of trade unionists here today. We don't have the support of the labor movement in the United States. We don't have the support of any major political party. We don't have broad support in American society for Palestinian rights. So we have a lot to learn from you in the United States. But the broad movement building that we're doing there, I think, is worth talking about. And so there's a few recent successes that I wanted to mention as examples. One of them was the campaign to get Lana Del Rey to not to play in Israel at a cultural festival. And that was something that JVP helped to lead on. And I think that was a very significant moment, because what I think is, and many other artists ended up withdrawing as well. And that was an almost purely internet-based campaign, an almost purely internet-based campaign, and it happened quite fast. And I think the impact of cultural boycott and of Israelis feeling like they are not getting to be part of global culture is incredibly important. And I think for musicians, if I were a musician or some other artist, why would you enter into a contract to go and play in Israel? It's just not worth the trouble. You're going to be campaigned against. You're going to have to either disappoint one side or the other. I think more and more we're going to see artists just ignore the problem, or not ignore the problem, but avoid the problem by not entering it at all, and that will have an impact on Israel, as Suresh was talking about this morning, or this afternoon in the apartheid, South African apartheid workshop. That's the sort of thing that has a real impact on Israeli society. So that was a very important win, and I hope it will presage the win about the Eurovision. I think that's a brilliant campaign. I'm so jealous of you guys in Europe who have that. It's fairly short term. It could be an enormous global win and bring a lot of attention, and also, I think, have a real impact on Israeli society. So I hope that campaign becomes something major in the next year. The other campaign I wanted to mention is a JVP campaign. Sorona mentioned it this morning. Our campaign is called Deadly Exchange, and it's trying to end police exchanges between the US and Israel. And most of those are run by Jewish American organizations. So we felt as Jewish Voice for Peace, we could take on that campaign and target those Jewish organizations for doing that more safely than other organizations that we work with could. And that was very important, and we've been building slowly that campaign over the last few years. And in Durham, a really incredible cross-community coalition came together. Black student activists, Muslim students, Jewish Voice for Peace, Latino and immigrant organizations, a really amazing array of coalition worked for 2 years and got the Durham City Council to say that it will not participate in police exchanges. One other one I want to mention, which is on the congressional level. We have a champion now in Congress. Her name is Representative Betty McCollum, and she's introduced legislation called No Way to Treat a Child. It's very small, focused legislation. The idea behind it is that U.S. military aid should not be going to supporting having Palestinian children in jail. Of course, we can set aside the irony of the ways U.S. military money is spent in other ways. But that legislation has been introduced and now has 30 co-sponsors. And again, that sounds a little embarrassing after hearing everything you said, Huda. But in the United States, it's a sea change. The fact that 30 legislators can openly endorse legislation like that, which, let's remember, is an S. That's the S in BDS. It's a sanctions campaign. If it were to pass, it would mean that we were imposing sanctions on Israeli military aid. So on every level, from from online activism to locally based, deep-rooted partnerships activism to Congress, we are building these smaller wins which add up to bigger wins. And I think that's the way that leading from education into action and having wins along the way is the way that we build movements, which is so important. And we know from polling, again, this is in the US, that, and from our own growth of JVP, JVP's membership has grown steadily and incredibly over the last many years. And we're up to 16,000 dues paying members. But we know that the emerging coalition on the left is made up of women, communities of color, young people, and people who have less money. And that coalition embraces Palestine as an integral part of a progressive agenda that includes other issues of fairness and justice and freedom. So in our context, that includes things like a living wage or single-payer health care or working against police violence. So we're really, our movement, I'm saying the broad movement in the United States, is really consciously situating Palestine on the left, like the progressive to left place, and that is reflected in who there is to work with. And there have historically been supporters who are sort of like old State Department hands who like worked in Arab countries mostly, who are interested in Palestinian rights from a sort of a U.S. interest perspective, from the interests of U.S. hegemony in the region. And we don't really have political principles in common with those people, and we're not choosing to build with those people. And I know I've had some interesting conversations in the week I've been here about concerns about losing conservative support if there's too much conscious building on the left. But I would say that in the US, that's actually very important to be conscious about what are the political principles by which we're building. Because in the United States, we've now created a partisan divide. It's very different than the bipartisan consensus that there used to be around Israel. And just like in other struggles, like in the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement, we will shift the narrative and ultimately shift policy by building a strong coalition that continues to expand until finally the right has to acquiesce. And so Suresh, in this workshop earlier, the South Africa workshop, which I got a lot of inspiration from, talked us through how the boycott campaign against South Africa grew thanks to hard organizing, smart campaigns, building across constituencies, and most importantly, not giving up. And that the things that seem so obvious now at the end and so easy were extremely hard while they were happening. And he also reminded us that at the height of the boycott campaign here in the UK, only about 25% of the population was actively practicing boycott. So we don't need everyone in order to get to a tipping point. And I think that's very important to remember. And just like in apartheid South Africa and the whitewashing of Mandela and King that was mentioned this morning, I think looking back, you know, we're gonna have the satisfaction of knowing that we were actually working for Palestinian rights, and everyone else will always claim to support it as well. And I look forward to that. Really monumental struggle right now. And again, I'm speaking from the US perspective, but I think also increasingly from a global perspective. I'm not just talking about Palestinian rights or Palestine. I mean, it's across all issues. It's about working against rising fascism. And you know, it's certainly the most politically active time that I can remember in my lifetime. And I think what's interesting, and by interesting I mean hard and terrifying, what's interesting about it is the right is ascendant and the left is ascendant. And we are in a struggle for our lives, and that's what it is. And we're going to have to force people to choose sides. There's not going to be a middle. We're going to need to battle it out, and we need to be thinking about Palestine in that context and every issue that many of us work on. And the way that we're doing that, again, has to be then by building cross-community coalitions and cross-national work with people, and it's based on principle. So I'm just checking my time. Okay. And so you have to do the hard work first. It doesn't come easy and it doesn't come automatically. You can't assume it. And I think one of the inspiring examples of that is a conference that two organizations in Israel-Palestine have put on a few times. Two organizations you might know, Zofrot, which is an Israeli organization that is dedicated to educating Jewish Israelis about the Nakba, and Badil, which is a refugee rights organization. And they do a lot of joint work together. And one thing they do is periodically put on an Envisioning Return conference. And they bring in architects and urban planners and social workers and community leaders to talk about what return would actually look like and thinking about it in concrete terms. And their deep partnership with each other is the sort of thing that's going to actually be able to build a society that's going to have to emerge in the next stage. And so I've been thinking so much about solidarity this week post-Pittsburgh. There was a terrible massacre of Jewish worshipers in a synagogue. I'm going to try not to cry because it actually is very emotional. And today's the first Shabbat since that happened. So it's meant a lot in the last week. But so my friend and rabbi, her name is Menon Grossman, she put it this way about safety through solidarity at a vigil this week for the victims. And there's a Yiddish phrase inside what she said, which if anyone here speaks Yiddish, I'm going to butcher it, and so I'm sorry. But the Yiddish means we will outlive them, and I think that's equally applicable in fighting white supremacy and anti-Semitism as it is Israeli oppression. So she said, our liberations are all bound up with each other, which means the only real way to safety is together. We will not silence our grief, our rage, or our joys. As the Yiddish saying goes, wir werden sie überleben. We will outlive them. Loudly, in full solidarity with all people whose humanity is threatened by systems of domination and abuse. Jewish friends, family, community, we are not alone. And our ancestors, I am so sure, are with us today and always. Sorry. There's one more crying part probably coming, which is the very end. And JVP has been working very strongly as part of our ongoing work since the Great Return March started last spring. We've been doing everything we can to support it in every way we've known how. And a couple of days ago, I got this note, which I also read at the public event I was at a couple of days ago, so apologies for those who are hearing this for the second time, but I think it's worth hearing again. So I got this note from the organizers of the Great Return March, and this is what they wrote to me. On behalf of the organizers of the Palestinian Great March of Return in Gaza, I would like to express to you and to all Jews in America our profound sympathy and solidarity in the face of the recent tragic massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Palestinians in Gaza share with American Jews the fear and pain that comes from racist actions. In America, Jews were targeted because they are Jews. In Palestine, we are cooped up in the tiny space of Gaza and not allowed to return because we are not Jews. We thank you for your many years of courageous support of the human rights of Palestinians. We wish to share with you that we stand in support of equality and the human rights of Jews in America and around the world. So, that level of humanity and compassion and the hard work we're all doing here together globally in this room, what we're going to take home, the way we're going to hopefully take inspiration from today and go back and double our efforts for Palestinian liberation and freedom. That's the deep work of solidarity, standing up for one another and defending one another and protecting one another and working for justice for one another. And that's how we're going to build a world in the end that we want to live in, where all people are equal, free, and secure. Thank you.